Welcome to another edition of Member Spotlight, our first edition for a brand new year. I'm Curtis Dean, your host, and we're excited to have you on. We are going to be talking throughout 2025 about all the great members of CBAN spread across the United States, 207 plus, and continuing to grow even as we speak. We would like to hear from you if there are, companies or providers out there that you think belong in our CBAN community. Then we would love for you to reach out to us. Our email address is hello@broadbandaction.com, and drop us an email, and we'll reach out. If you've got someone who works for another company that you say, hey, these guys do great work in the broadband industry, they should be in CBAN, or hey, my neighboring provider, they're a really good community-focused provider, and they should also be part of CBAN. Make that introduction. We'd love to have them on board our network. And of course, you can always learn more about CBAN by going to our website. It's broadbandaction.com. There 24/7 to answer your questions. So you can also, of course, always email us at hello if you have any questions about anything we're doing here at CBAN. Okay, enough housekeeping. Our member spotlight today is on ECC Technologies. And so it is my pleasure to bring in our guest today, Mark Mayerhofer. He's with ECC Technologies, a CBAN associate member. And Mark, thank you so much for coming on board and helping us shine the spotlight on what ECC is and what you do.
Sure. Glad to be with you this morning, Curtis. Thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. Well, first of all, I always start these by trying to find out your own personal journey to ECC Technologies. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today and get to be on a podcast with me.
Yeah, sure, Curtis. Yeah, so I'm director of broadband here at ECC Technologies, coming up on my 2-year anniversary. And prior to that, I actually worked for one of the large ISPs in the country. You can pick one of the two.
There's not a lot to choose from there when you look at
right, or 2 or 3, right? So, yeah. I really, in that role, I was actually in a government affairs role with that, but got very involved in broadband networks and building out of our company's network at the time, and really got a taste for, how do we help communities get access to broadband? There's still a lot out there that we're all the yourself, Curtis, and I know a lot of the membership is aware, of course, of the real need out there to reach the unserved. And when I had an opportunity to come over to ECC Technologies, I really thought this was a great opportunity for me as a career move, and really liked what Joe Starks, our president and CEO, had created here now over 29 years ago to really help communities build these broadband networks in areas that, quite frankly, a lot of the ISPs, in particular large ones, really didn't have an interest in doing for various reasons. So glad to be here and help really take that next stage of providing that access that a lot of these counties and regional councils that we work with around New York State and around the country to gain access.
Well, I'll tell you, that's going to be music to the ears of the community members that we have, who are all part of the CBAN family, because they are trying to push that rock up the hill, right? Let's get better broadband for the people we serve, and it is a journey. It's not something you can do instantly, but it's nice to know that there are entities out there like ECC and others that can help people along that journey. You guys are based in New York, is that correct?
That's correct, right. And right outside of Rochester, New York, Monroe County, for right along Lake Ontario, for those that are familiar with the area. So, sure. And we also have office down in Raleigh, North Carolina. And really going back to the founding, just to touch base again on our roots really with communities, that's really, Joe Starks really started it back in early 2000s with what's now the Development Authority of the North Country's telecommunications network, over 2,000 miles of an open access network. And it really started, grassroots, right? It was working with the local school district, trying to get fiber to them. And really we became, the company we are today really became a pioneer in creating these fiber optic networks. Because you got to think about it, Curtis, right? I mean, this is only 25 years ago now. a
Yeah.
lot of people weren't talking about fiber optic networks back then. And the networks was very nascent, the technology. Everyone was looking at coaxial cable, and fiber really became what it is today, right? Over time, but really pride ourselves on being pioneers in that effort and working with these communities to create, as I said, now a 2,000-mile network in upstate New York.
My own journey began with a humble but lovable HFC network in Spencer, Iowa, and the explosion of growth led to eventually they rebuilt their network to fiber to the home. But we started with the best technology that was affordable at the time, and then iterated, at least Spencer did, into now a fully XGS-PON network that's out there doing capabilities of up to 10 gig services. So let's talk about the networks that you guys have been part of putting together in New York. Is this a mix of middle mile and last mile? Is it, talk through that project?
Yeah, that's kind of also had its own journey. So it really started with and continues to be middle mile up until recently. So these are all middle mile networks we've been involved in. As I mentioned, a 2,000-mile network in what's called the North Country. For those that are familiar with New York State, you're looking at St. Lawrence County, along the St. Lawrence River, Jefferson County, and up through part of the Adirondacks, a very challenging area to provide service in. So again, that was the first one, and then about 10 years later, the Southern Tier Network was the next one that ECC helped launch, and this is now a 600-mile network. At the time, it was 200 miles, but again, it continues to grow. And this really started with a partnership with Corning, who, of course, everyone's familiar with Corning. They make an awful lot of fiber optic cables in this for the industry. So and community, again, the community groups that were out there saying we don't want to be left behind. We see this as really technology that's going to pave the way to the future. Again, this is around 2011, so we're well on our ways in terms of what the internet was starting to look like, and the its omnipresent nature in our lives and what it is. So again, fast forward, as I said, from 10 years out from Dank, and that was really the next network we helped create, and then moved into Access Ontario, which is another one just south of the Rochester area, on one in Monroe County. And then as of today, we're actually building one in Erie County, New York, called the ErieNet. That is also an open access network that's going to be up and running next year. So those are all the networks we've been involved in New York State. And again, there's another one in North Carolina where we have offices called MCNC. And we do everything from design of the network, help with obviously with funding, state, federal, local funding to get these networks up and running, and then operations and sales. We really do it all. We've run 24/7 operations for them to help them get up off the ground, and then they become their own entity. A lot of times they form a not-for-profit. Some states have this ability, some don't. But in New York State, we're fortunate that we have an ability through state law called the Local Development Corporation. So that's what they ultimately generally become, are these local development corporations. In some cases, the networks are sold off. Ontario Access was sold off. But we're happy to say that all these networks are sustainable and still in operation today. So to get to the next step, in terms of last mile, that's now what it's becoming. In fact, New York State government in particular has been looking at using these open access models to get down to last mile, because typically open access network stays at a middle mile level. They'll serve large corporations, county buildings, that sort of thing, healthcare industry, public safety, certainly cell towers, really added benefit. A lot of cell towers are operating off the Dank and SDN network. But a very recent development, as I was saying, is this fiber to the home, doing the last mile. And it's really part of the New York State Municipal Infrastructure Program that's made that happen. And we have been involved as a company with pursuing those grant funds and have been quite successful in doing so. In fact, now we're leading to, not only, helping them get those grants, but then moving into the next phase of now building those projects. And that's really going to be a lot of our time spent over the next 2 years, because this is all part of the ARPA funding, which comes out of capital projects fund. So it all needs to be done by the end of 26. So certainly a lot of work to be done. And as I said, the switch from more of an open access to a last mile was really driven by New York State, quite frankly. They were the one that said any application needs to include unserved, underserved addresses. We still have the opportunity to go by served addresses as well. That was another exception that New York State made. I mean, as you know, especially with BEAD and other programs, the focus has always been on unserved. But New York State recognized the need to get to these unserved areas. You're going through served areas. So, that's certainly not the main goal of the program, because the main goal is to do unserved, but while also building out these open access middle mile networks. So, again, over 25 years now, it's gone from this nascent model of, well, how do you do these networks to, okay, now that they're up and running, let's start moving toward a fiber to the home as part of this, part of these open access networks.
Well, the word served always gets my dander up a little bit, because there's served and there's well served. And talking with many of our members who are building networks, they run into that issue where, okay, in order to get to the unserved, I have to pass served. I can't get funded for that because they're considered served. But then you look how they're served, they may be served by somebody who has really horrible customer service or a bad reliability because they're relying on old technology. And so even when the funding isn't there, there's a benefit to the consumer. Even though they may be considered served, they could be better served if a different provider were able to be there. And competition fuels innovation, competition fuels quality. So and so many of our broadband households in America are not subject to competition right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Curtis. And in fact, when we went through the process of applying for these state grant funds, that's one of the things we focused on was, instead of just saying by the federal definition what are unserved and underserved, we wanted to take that underserved in particular and kind of stretch the definition, if you will, and say, well, we're going to consider them those that don't have access to fiber optic networks, right? Because even though the cable industry in particular on the coax side is moving towards symmetrical speeds, really the fiber optic network, a true fiber to the premises network, will not have any issues getting those speeds, symmetrical speeds and lower latency, just by their very nature. That's I'm sure a lot of your audience is familiar with that, right? So
I think that symmetry is vital to being served, especially when you see, a lot of industry reporting lately about how upload bandwidth growth is exceeding download bandwidth growth. It's like it's catching up, and it's catching up because people finally have access to networks where they're not only getting downloads at a 10th or a fifth of the speeds. They're actually getting access to gigabit uploads or better. And they're figuring out ways to use it for things like content creation.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also a point we haven't touched on yet, Curtis, but you just did a little bit ago, is the need to create competition. And that's what you see oftentimes with these open access networks. With DANK, the Development Authority in North Country, they're at 20 plus ISPs who utilize that network. And as we all know, once you see that competition, you see innovation, right? You see other, legacy ISPs upgrading their network to fiber so that they can stay competitive. Because one of the things we continue to hear, and that's also why it was important for us on these projects we worked on to get these grants, why it was important to us to go through quote unquote served areas, because what we found was when we're looking for partners that don't have the capital to do it, but would under a state grant system, right? Other ISPs, the smaller ones, right? They will always say, if you can get me through areas that are served by coax, I can be competitive there because it's an all fiber network, right? So we know that, right? This is industry led in part, right? In terms of how we develop these networks. And again, that will help bring prices down right? Because you're creating competition, and give people access to the higher bandwidths and whatnot that they need in today's environment.
I was just talking the other day to a newer CBAN member. It's a community, and they're in the process of potentially, hopefully, building an open access fiber network in their community. And I asked about, how's it going? Are you lining up providers? And they said, well, we have 2 providers that are ready to come on and compete with each other and provide services on our open access network when it's ready. Neither one of them are the incumbents. And they said the incumbents will not even talk to them. And I've always thought that was kind of interesting. Is it a control issue? If you're a phone company and you could still serve people and do a great job at it and avoid the cost of upgrading to your DSL plan, why wouldn't you do that? But I think it's really just, we don't want to play with you because we don't get to decide and control everything. Mm-hmm. Those are big incumbent providers that they're in their own ecosystem and don't maybe always play well with others. I get my little dig in at the big guys there. So, Mark, I always like to ask our guest on Member Spotlight to maybe shine up your crystal ball. We've got an incredible year ahead with BEAD, and at least knock on wood, BEAD gets to happen, and BEAD finally gets out of the gate. Let's put it that way. What are some of the things you see ahead, both opportunities and challenges for the broadband industry?
Well, I certainly think, as you said, Curtis, from an opportunity standpoint, certainly with the $42 billion now coming out of the gates, if you will, out of the BEAD program, I think there's definitely opportunity. All these states have been well prepared. Some say over prepared to do it. In terms of all the back and forth that's occurred over the past several years to finally get this program from, I'll say conceptual to actual. Okay, let's go out and build networks now. So, I mean, there's certainly plenty of opportunities out there, and we've been involved with various states, whether it's obviously very heavily in New York State, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Oklahoma. We've been involved in these states, and everyone's a little different, right? So I think a state like New Jersey, right, there's a lot of opportunity there based on the funding they have to go above and beyond what they had hoped for, meaning, okay, we have enough funding from the federal government to get all the unserved done. Okay, let's talk about some of the challenges, right? To your point, what are the challenges? Well, how do we rewire high-rise buildings that house low-income residents, right? Some of the public housing areas that are notorious for having bad coverage once you get inside these buildings, and what needs to be done when you get inside there. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and each state is a little different in how they approach it. But really, this is almost a golden age of internet access, right? And building these networks that we're about to head into here, and hopefully everything continues on the path in DC. Anytime you have a change in administration, you're certainly going to have some potential changes about what's eligible and what's not, and what under what terms that funding will come through the pipeline. But we're hopeful that this continues to happen. And now, having said that, I think the challenge, and this actually came up in some other conferences I've been at throughout 2024, the real challenge to BEAD and the public policy that was set forth, if you will, was it's unique in that it's really the first program to anyone's knowledge to say, okay, this needs to be 100% coverage. Right. It's hard to do that out of the gates, right? To have any program that goes 100% coverage. In fact, I was surprised myself to realize, as much as everyone compares BEAD and what we're doing now to the Electrification Act, of what the 1920s or 30s, right? There's still places in this country, in New York State, that don't have access to electricity, right? So as much as we hold that up as the shining example, like, well, that wasn't 100% coverage either, and this is, coming up 100 years later, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's really the challenge, really, to BEAD and what NTIA is facing. And I really think that's what's caused the delay. In fact, we're seeing it with projects that we're currently trying to get off the ground, get from sort of a what's called a conditional award to a final award, right? Because there's what the states then need to do if they're using this funding. to then take them off the BEAD list, if you will, right? Because that's in
Right.
part what New York State's doing. Well, then they have to then prove that there's what's called an enforceable commitment. And
Right.
according to the NTIA, right, that means you have to show me that every address that we show as unserved on the FCC broadband map will be served. And there's a lot of back and forth, and those lists can become quite cumbersome to deal with, shall we say, that
Yeah.
consistently get updated. We have another update coming up very shortly.
Soon. Yeah, I think by the end of the
very
year.
shortly. They're calling now the 5.1 data. So again, which will continue to get updated. And I understand that, maybe even some of your members can get very frustrated. We do, certainly, on inaccuracy in that data. So again, that's going to continue to be the challenge, is getting to that 100% number. And, New York State, at least in terms of their BEAD grant application, which just came out earlier this week, they've recognized that the challenge to get to 100%. So they've kind of created two levels, because as much as so they've created these project areas within counties, just to give your listeners an example of what's going on in New York State. So they have 308 project areas. So the counties are all split up, and you have a total of 308 across the state. But as you know, Curtis, you get into some of these areas, and let's say there's 320 unserved addresses in a project area. Okay, I can probably get to, let's say a provider comes in and says, I can get to 290 of these, but to get to the remaining 30, those are tough. And here's why. This one's going to cost me 200,000, and here's why. And that becomes the other challenge, right? And we almost need to look at it from a perspective of, what should the dynamic be, right? What should the point be at which we look at some other way to provide internet access to them? And I understand there's a need and an interest in making sure there's digital equity, right? In other words, everyone has access to the same speeds, the same latency, but you get into some of these areas and that may not be possible. But I think it's still possible to get them access that can do most things that we want to do these days, through the internet.
I'm just as big a fan of fiber as a lot of us in the industry, but I'm also a realist and realize that, those $200,000 locations are just not a great investment for anybody, public dollars or private dollars, and that other technologies like some of the advanced next generation fixed wireless, low Earth orbit, all of that stuff is going to have to play a role if we'll ever get to even 99%, much less 100% coverage. So
sure, yeah.
Well, Mark, it's been great having you on today. I really appreciate your insight. We'll maybe chat about this again some other time, because I do believe we could go on all day, especially with your depth of knowledge and background and working in the areas that you do. Hopefully we'll get to run into each other down the line at conferences all over the place as we look at our travel schedules for 2025. Thanks again.
Yeah, sounds good, Curtis. Glad to be with you today, and certainly for any of your listeners. You've heard a little bit about ECC. If you're looking for help, especially with open access networks and working with communities and trying to get these up and off the ground, feel free to reach out to us. You see our ECCtech.com.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Our guest today on Member Spotlight is Mark Mayerhofer. He is with ECC Technologies, a CBAN associate member. Appreciate your time today, Mark. And thank you, all of you, for watching and listening to Member Spotlight.